Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the regularly scheduled board meeting of the Willoughby-Eastlake Schools Board of Education. We're here at 35353 Curtis Boulevard in Eastlake, Ohio. It is now 7 o'clock. Mr. Charnella, would you please call the roll?
Dr. Beal?
Here.
Mr. Jones?
Here.
Mr. Millar?
Here.
Mr. Roskis?
Here.
Mrs. Zern?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I'd like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item 1 on the agenda is public comment. We have 3 phone calls that were sent in. Ms. McKinney, would you play the first call?
Hi, my name is Heather Freeman. I reside in Eastlake, Ohio. My question for the board would be, how many people actually tested positive at Longfellow and Edison over the weekend that warranted the schools to shut down? Secondly, I would respectfully request that the board review the reopening guidelines and take a look at how we can try to keep schools open with limited numbers of positive cases of COVID. There are surrounding school districts that have more cases than we do, and children are still being safe and in school in person, and I'd really like the board to reconsider the reopening guidelines. Thank you. Bye.
That question will be addressed in our open session when we review all of the numbers. So Mrs. Freeman will be able to directly answer that question later in our board meeting.
Jennifer Toothman, address is in Willoughby on Hayes Avenue. My question is, what will the school do to provide for transportation to and from home for the children in the Excel programs?
The answer to that is, and thank you for your question, currently Monday, Tuesday, tomorrow, and Wednesday, transportation was from the buildings itself, which I know presents a challenge for a lot of folks. But we needed a few days to reroute. Starting Thursday, all Excel Tech students there'll be neighborhood pickups, so they won't have to get themselves too north or too south. There'll be a direct pickup in the neighborhood from your homes to your Excel Tech programs. Great question.
Okay, thank you. And the third call, Ms. McKinney?
Jeremy Amos, Willoughby, Ohio. Children at School of Innovation. I just would like to address the drastic measures that are being taken based on the evidence that is stated in the letter that we received about a few children being exposed, not necessarily having the virus, but being exposed to the virus at 2 elementary schools, neither which my children attend, and that being caused to close down all the schools in the district. I find that a really drastic measure, considering the neighboring school districts around us do not abide by anything remotely similar to this. So I would just like some clarification on why we are choosing to do this and how this is truly beneficial to our children when there is just enormous amounts of data that continue to pour in each and every day about the health and wellness of our children and their mental stability and their emotional stability, about what's happening in some homes from a abuse standpoint, and how the virus has very little to no impact on children. And so I just want to know what the reasoning is behind this. Is this something coming from the Board of Health? Because if it is, I'm confused why other districts are not abiding by it as well. And in addition, I'd like to know what's our long-term plan, because to me, this isn't a long-term plan. This is just random drastic measures with kind of no rhyme or reason. And I'm just to expect and anticipate this happening on and off throughout the entire year. We had the choice to send our kids back or not. For those families that did not, they had that choice. But I chose to send my kids back as they were eager to go. And yet now my choice is being eliminated, and I'm having no say in the matter. I am confused and frustrated, considering that my taxes go up every year, and I vote yes for the levies in hopes that I can have a say and a choice in what goes on in my school district. Yet here I am with no choice and no say in the matter, and more or less being told that I have to do what everyone else had decided not to send their kids back are doing, even though I'd consider that not beneficial to my children, as their education is not nearly the same as it is in the classroom. As a spouse of a teacher, I know that in classroom teaching far exceeds at-home online learning. So I would like those questions to be answered. I'd like to know if this is really about the kids or if it's about the school budget and the elimination of certain positions and busing and whatnot, allowing us to save some money during this pandemic, which I hope it is not, because that would be using the pandemic for personal gains and personal reasons, and which I would hope we were bigger than that and better than that. But if you could just address those questions at some point, I'd really appreciate it, as my emails have been unresponded to.
There are obviously a lot of questions rolled into that to that phone call, but thank you for sharing that. The numbers we're going to go through, and I think that will help you later in the board meeting get a better sense of the process that we're going through. I would also reference you to our reopening guidelines, which have been out since this summer, and whether or not you may feel they're too aggressive. They've been out for public consumption, and I think it's going to be eye-opening for people when they see the complete and total data. But I rest assured that finances play no role in our decision-making whatsoever. And I don't disagree that in-person learning is best for most kids, not all kids, but best for most kids. And the board will revisit our reopening plans and what our target date is for reopening and how we'll move forward from here. So that, I believe, we'll be able to address all of your questions in this board meeting. So thank you for sharing.
I'd like to thank Heather, Jennifer, and Jeremy for sending in those phone calls, and hopefully we'll be able to get those questions answered. The next item of business is the approval of the minutes of September 14th, 2020. Do I hear a motion?
Mr. President,
Yes, please.
I make the motion to approve item 2A, approval of the minutes of September 14th, 2020.
Thank you, Mrs. Zern. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President,
Mr. Jones?
I'd like to second that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Is there any discussion? Mr. Charnella?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Item 2B is the approval of minutes of September 22nd, 2020. Do I hear a motion to approve those minutes?
Mr.
Yes.
President, I will make a motion to approve item 2B, approval of minutes of September 22nd, 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Roskis. Is there a second? Mr. Merher?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Merher. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Charnell?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Next item for the agenda is the treasurer's report. Mr. Charnell?
All right. Letter A for your consideration in the consent calendar are the month-end financials for September 30th, 2020. You can still see that there is a low cash balance in January. However, we do believe that we're in a position to clear that. That is, those are general fund dollars. Letter B for your consideration are certificates of deposit with Farmers National Bank. Now, I did just mention a low cash balance in January. However, that is the general fund only. This is all funds within our bank account. So I'm making a recommendation to invest $5.1 million in various CDs with various maturities to take advantage of interest rates as they continue to fall. For example, Star Ohio was at about 0.25% 2 weeks ago, and now it's down to 0.18%. So interest rates are falling. I thought it was best for the taxpayer dollar to try to secure some interest before it just goes down to zero.
Thank you, Mr. Charnello. This is not an item on the consent calendar, so do I hear a motion to approve item 3A, certificates of deposit with Farmers National Bank?
Mr. President,
Mr. Jones?
I motion to approve item 3B, certificates of deposit with Farmers National Bank.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Do I hear a second? Mr. Murhart? Thank you, Mr. Murhart. Is there any discussion? Mr. Charnello?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Murrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Abstain.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 4-0.
Mr. Charnello?
Letter C for your consideration is the closing of the bank account for the Coster Scholarship with Star Ohio. As in the previous agenda item, we move that money into a CD, a certificate of deposit, as we believe that is an endowment fund, so that $100,000 cannot be awarded. It's only the interest that can be awarded in a scholarship. So instead of being in a liquid account, we wanted to, secure it into a certificate of deposit and get a higher interest rate.
Thank you.
Letter 3D, service agreement with Frontline Education. This is for a new time clock software. We have a current software called Chronos. It goes away at the end of December, and we were looking for various solutions, and we felt this integrated well with our current processes in place, and not only that, it was half the price.
Great. And that also is not on the consent calendar, so do I hear a motion to approve item 3D, service agreement with Frontline Education?
Mr. President,
Mrs. Zern?
I make the motion to approve item 3D, service agreement with Frontline Education.
Thank you, Mrs. Zern. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President,
Sure.
I will second that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Roskis. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Charnello?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Murrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. Letter 3E, insurance consulting agreement. I'd like to make the recommendation for the DCW Consulting Group effective November 13th, 2020. Just felt that it was nice to bring in fresh eyes to review our current health insurance and how we're going about the health insurance. It is, a large expense, and it just seems to be going up every year. So I'd like to bring in fresh eyes. We had to give a 60-day notice to our former group, which is why it is effective November 13th.
Thank you. Do I hear a motion to approve item 3E, insurance consulting agreement?
Mr. President,
Yes.
I motion to approve item 3E, insurance consulting agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Do I hear a second? Mr. Roskis?
Mr. President, I will second the motion.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Charnello?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Murrar? Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 4-0.
I would just like to note that amongst many things Nick has found as he's been diligently reviewing documents, reviewing agreements, reviewing finances, has been our issue to address a challenge with our health insurance. So I think it's important for you as board members to know that that was some new information that he found that was pretty important for me and for all of us here on the board to know. And I don't think we would have caught that without Nick's diligence. So that's
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Letter 3F, purchase orders and blanket certificates. We have one purchase order that needs a then and now certificate for Viva Spanish language programs. These are for materials and program workbooks. And also blanket certificates of $50,000 or more for Ohio Bureau of Workers' Comp, Medical Mutual of Ohio, NEO for health reimbursement account, state teacher retirement system, and re-ed transportation for the transportation of students attending re-ed. That is for the consent calendar. Letter 3G, transfer to unclaimed funds. These are funds that we are asking to be moved to the general fund, as these are stale checks. So we're asking it from the general fund to the 07 for the agency fund. These are for stale dated checks that are over 6 months old. Letter 3H, transfer to funds. This is transferring the carryover from the 2020 RSVP grant to the 2021 RSVP grant in the amount of $79,110.30. Letter 3I, transfer of funds. This is to close out the copy center fund and then move those funds to the general fund, and then move them from the general fund to the people support account at NCI. (3J), these are student activity budget purpose statements, goals, and they're all listed there for your consideration. Letter 3K, gifts and donations. Lubrizol donated $2,000 for the Bridge to Success program at NCI Willoughby. Does anyone know how to say that name? Swagelock donated metal valued at $11,960.20 to the welding program at NCIW. Michael Lynn donated a 1992 Chevy truck to the auto collision program at NCIW. The Ford Motor Corporation donated 2012 Ford Focus to the auto collision program at NCIW. The South High Boosters donated $2,375 to the South Girls Soccer pay-to-play fees. And Office Depot donated an e-gift card worth $835.02 as a part of their roundup at the Register program for the benefit of Edison.
I'd just like to thank those entities for their generous donations. It truly makes a difference in our building program, so thank you.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the superintendent's report.
Thank you, Mr. President. First item is our questions and answers. These are from last month. A North High School student at our last meeting speak about scheduling conflicts with respect to lunch. And because of this conflict, he was unable to access lunch. So scheduling event, or these kind of conflicts occur in a very isolated group, but they can sometimes impact students that attend PSEO at Lakeland for part of the day, and depending on when they return, can be challenging. Students come for part of the day due to another program that overlaps meals. Sometimes that's a challenge. But regardless of when, how the scheduling works, we make sure that we get students meals. And in this particular student, we're able to get his schedule squared away so that he can get back and have lunch. So that is a squared away problem, but it does come up from time to time. And I believe that is their only questions from last month, Mr. President.
All right, item 5A, resolution.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a resolution to authorize the superintendent and/or treasurer to act on behalf of the board against Purdue Pharma LP, which is an opioid crisis, or an opioid manufacturer amongst other drugs, and there is currently litigation, and we are part of the party in the suit amongst many other entities and school districts across the country. So this just allows us to be able to do that.
Do I hear a motion to accept item 5B, Willoughby-Eastlake Administrative and 5A, resolution to authorize the superintendent and/or treasurer to act on behalf of the board against Purdue Pharma LP? Mr. Merhart?
I'll make a motion to approve
Thank you, Mr. Merhart. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President,
Mr. Jones?
I'd like to second that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, I have a question, Steve. So it says that we're not a named party, but we do have involvement per se. And how do we track potentially those costs that I guess we may have been wrong?
That is a question that I'll have to get back to you on. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. And basically, how it came about was almost a blanket email, if you will, from probably the law firm recruiting entities to be part of the suit. And you had a certain period of time to respond, to be part of that suit. So that specific answer, I'll have to research and
Okay.
get back to you.
No worries, thank you, Steve.
Sorry.
Any other discussion? Mr. Trinella?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar? Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. Item B for your consideration is the Willoughby-Eastlake Administrative and Exempt Employee Compensation Plan and Schedule of Benefits. This is no additional cost to the district, no additional compensation to anyone. Again, I guess it's your night, Nick. Give Nick credit for discovering the lack in a document to back up some information that the state required. So he created that document for us in collaboration with Mr. Murphy. And so we meet the requirements, and it requires that the board adopt this resolution so that he can send it to STRS and SERS, correct?
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Do I hear a motion to approve Resolution 5B, Willoughby-Eastlake Administrative and Exempt Employee Compensation Plan and Schedule of Benefits?
Mr. President, the motion to approve 5B.
B.
5B.
Thank you, Mr. Merhart. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President, I will.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Zern. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Trinella?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Passes 5-0.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. Item C for your consideration is a resolution giving the superintendent the authority to make Wednesdays for the remainder of the school year asynchronous learning from home for all students in grades 6 through 12. Please remember grades 6 through 12. We're not talking about elementary students. Grades 6 through 12, these are students that are currently half-day, as well as K-5 virtual students, so the virtual students. Okay, so that which doesn't really impact them directly as very much. In fact, we think overall that it benefits all of our students. But anyway, we surveyed our parents, and I think that was important because what we're looking to do is our 6 through 12 teachers are balancing virtual learning and in-classroom learning simultaneously, which has proven to be very challenging for our teachers to keep up with. Our parents have a lot of questions, as you can imagine, and so do students. And so trying to find time to make all this work has become challenging. So what we're asking for is that asynchronous means students will still be doing projects. There'll be graded projects, graded work, but the teachers will have 2 hours each Wednesday of totally dedicated in office time for parents to log on and meet with them one-on-one, as will students during that 2-hour time period. And then that gives our teachers just a little bit more time to plan and keep that process moving as smoothly and improve it as much as we possibly can. In our K-5 virtual world, it's giving those teachers the same opportunity that we hear echoing from the community that they want to meet with their teachers, have more time, and the students more time one-on-one. So they have the same requirements as would our 6-12 teachers. The K-5 brick and mortar students, there's no change to their schedule at all as a result of this change. So in our survey, there were 1,850 respondents, and they came from all across the district. 80% of those students, 1,480, were brick and mortar students, and 20%, or 370, were virtual students or virtual parents who responded. I shouldn't say virtual parents, that sounded weird, didn't it? They were parents of virtual students. And the survey results came back that there are 64.4%, or 1,192 of those parents would take advantage of virtual office hours, or their students would take advantage of virtual office hours. We asked the question, if the district made this change, would your child remain home on Wednesdays, would that present a challenge to your family? And we're at 80%, or 1,466, it would not create a challenge or a problem for, but 20% it would create a challenge for. So we're working to mitigate those challenges for those students. So generally speaking, I believe that this is something that the teaching staff supports, the administration supports, and the vast majority of parents will find it useful.
Thank you. Do I hear a motion to approve item 5C, resolution giving the superintendent the authority to make Wednesdays for the remainder of the school year asynchronous learning from home for all students in grades 6 through 12, as well as all K-5 virtual students starting with the second quarter?
Which the quarter ends this Friday.
Okay.
So it's not this Wednesday, it would be the following Wednesday.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
To approve item 5C.
Thank you, Mr. Maher. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President, I will second that motion.
Do I hear any discussion?
Steve, I have a question on this one. So for the 2-hour virtual learning, like office hours, is that consistent, like a specific portion of the day? Or it's
Right.
going to stay consistent by every week?
Be a schedule.
Yeah. So the plan is that the teachers are going to put out a schedule, and then people will be able to sign up for 5, 10, it could be a half-hour increment if there's not a lot of need, and the conversation needs to be longer, or if there are 30 parents who want to meet on that day, maybe it'll be in 10-minute increments or 5-minute increments. So there'll be a schedule posted each week so that parents know when they can log on, or students know when they can request a meeting time.
Sure.
On those Wednesdays.
So the teachers will be able to kind of set their own time for those
That's correct.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
And the students who are struggling then will have an additional avenue to try to keep up.
That's the goal, is that the students will take advantage of this as well as the parents. Struggling student, I don't understand something, I don't want to ask the question in front of the entire online class, that at least once a week you'd be able to schedule an appointment and look at a piece of instruction or a piece of curriculum to get more clarification. So it's really office hours, much like you might see office hours in a college, where a college student could walk in, ask a litany of questions of their professor. Very similar idea.
Is there any other discussion?
But all students, grades 6 through 12, will be home basically on Wednesdays?
That's correct. That's
Okay.
what that would mean.
Okay,
Correct.
so we'll come to the building, we'll just do all the work from home?
That's correct.
And if they want to set up a virtual time with the teacher, or if the parent does, then they can schedule that as well in between what they're doing for the day?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So asynchronous means that those students they're not going to be contacting virtually live with the teacher like they do on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday.
They'll just be working on their own.
That's
stuff
correct.
at their own pace.
That's correct. But responsible for those assignments, and that's how attendance will be taken, completing those assignments.
Any further discussion? Mr. Charnella?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Murr?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe your item D is different than my item D. And your original item D was a resolution relating to Thanksgiving break or Christmas break. I am withdrawing that from your consideration due to the fact that at this point, I think it hamstrings our decision or the board's decision in the process of determining when to come back. I don't want that seems like that would really cloud the decision-making process if you thought, well, the superintendent could send students home from Thanksgiving. That Thanksgiving's not that far away, really, in the scheme of things. So I would rather take that away, reduce that confusion that could exist even at this level, certainly in the community level, and that's why I have withdrawn that for consideration. So that means the next item is the personnel agenda.
Right.
And the people that appear before you for your consideration are folks that are waiting for all, well, I shouldn't say waiting, all must receive satisfactory records report from the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, the Ohio Department of Education, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation before they become full employees of the school district. So most of the things that you see at this time of year are supplemental contracts.
Right, and that is not part of the consent agenda, so do I hear a motion to approve item 5D, personnel agenda?
Mr. President, I will make a motion to approve item 5D, personnel agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Roskis. Do I hear a second? Ms. Maher? Thank you. Do I hear any discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Shinella?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Passes 5-0.
Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. The next item for your consideration is a first read of a policy. It is a change to policy 6144, which has to do with our investments. And once again, Nick is just, he's riding that white horse. So I'll let you, if you will, Nick, just give us a brief summary of the need for this revision.
Here's just a one-sentence insert. I contacted Red Tree Investments just to see if down the road, and we did decide to invest with them, if our policy was up to par, and they said that we were missing a sentence. So we ran it by Neola. Neola agreed, and it's up for approval. Or up for first read approval in November.
Okay. So as an item of business, that's it, is just the first read tonight. Mr. Thompson, item 7.
Other business, but I would recommend as we're going through this process and knowing we have folks online that are watching, it might make more sense if we do the public part of the presentation and then go into executive session. But either way, they're going to have to hold online before we can give them a decision about what our target date is for return. Well, I guess we'll just stick with this order.
Do you have an approximate amount of time that your presentation will take for the executive session?
I think we can do it expeditiously and be done in about 15 minutes.
Okay, so that anyone who is watching online will know that they can come back in about 15 minutes, and that's when we should reconvene the meeting.
Yes, and I apologize to those of you online, but trying to get this information to the board, and then I want to give the community information that I think will be very helpful, and then the board needs that information in order to make an informed decision.
Well then, do I hear a motion to adjourn to executive session to consider the appointment, employment, dismissal, discipline, promotion, demotion, or compensation of a public employee or official?
Mr. President, I make the motion to adjourn to executive session to consider the appointment. There's a typo in there. Dismissal, discipline, promotion, demotion, or compensation of a public employee or official.
Thank you, Mrs. Zern. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President, I second the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. So we will be adjourned to executive session for approximately 15 minutes. Traylon?
Are we still live? Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
We are now in executive session.
Thank you, Mr. Traylon. adjourn executive session and reconvene into regular session.
I'll make the motion.
Thanks, Mr. Marhart. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President, I will second the motion.
Thanks, Mrs. Zern. Is there discussion? Mr. Charnello?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
You're out at 8:02.
Okay. So we have reconvened, Patrick? We've reconvened into regular session, and we've changed the camera configuration a little bit so that people that are watching our live stream can see the information as we are seeing it. Mr. Thompson, you have a presentation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I want to remind people of and our board of the current verbiage in our reopening plans, our reopening guidelines that we set forth this past summer. So the plan says that in any elementary school, 1, 2, 3, 4 students could be COVID positive or presumed COVID positive in a classroom. As long as they're contained in that classroom, only that classroom would be quarantined. If, for example, you had a couple kids in one classroom and another outbreak in another classroom of students, at least one student or more, that would cause the entire building to close. And why was that decision made? To refresh your memories, it was made because it's, according to the Lake County Board of Health, that's beginning to show that the community of that school is seeing some sort of outbreak. So it's cautious, yes. It's cautious, yes. But that's the reason that two separate classrooms would trigger an elementary closure. Then in high school or middle school, the complicating factor there is one student can expose so many students over the course of a school day. They could have 6 or 7 different classes, lunch times, they could be in extracurricular activities. So the risk of exposure is exponentially higher. Our experience so far is one student ends up exposing, and exposure is defined as 10 minutes or more in proximity of that student. That happens, that one student hits about 80%. According to Dr. Mohammed Jafar, who we work with from the Lake County Board of Health, one student exposes 20 to 25 students that we consider high risk. And that would be, on average, a student at lunch when masks are down, a student at band when masks are down, or various other activities where they're in contact with that student with masks down, making obviously transmission much higher, much more likely. So in middle school and high school, one student who quarantines multiple students and staff, which would be a trigger to remember if you happen to attend our town hall meeting. One of the ways that I stated then that I feared could shut us down the fastest out of all the scenarios was the inability to staff. So one student knocks out almost every teacher they're in contact with. So that's 7 on average teachers that one student in middle school or high school would impact. A second student obviously is another 100 or so students, most likely, and another 7 staff members. So when you have 2 students in one building, we've knocked out 14 staff members in that building alone for a minimum of a 14-day quarantine because they had direct exposure to somebody who's COVID positive or presumed COVID positive. Now you've heard me use that word, presumed COVID positive. What does that mean? That means that if, for example, I am COVID positive as a father, and my daughter was obviously exposed to me, my daughter most likely would be unable to receive a test. Most likely the doctors would indicate that this is a presumed positive person. And they go into the same quarantine protocols as does a COVID tested positive person. Secondly, an exposed person who's asymptomatic or very likely doesn't even have COVID follows the same 14-day quarantine as does the tested COVID positive person. So that applies to staff and that applies to those individuals. So what you're,
And
I'm
that's
sorry.
the Board of Health's recommendation, correct?
That's correct. There is nothing that we do in isolation without, we talk daily to the nursing staff. Catherine talks daily to the nursing staff and Dr. Jafar. So that happens regularly.
So when people would say that the CDC said 15 minutes and you're saying 10, that's not our school district saying 10.
No, that is not our school district saying 10. The county can make a decision to increase the rigor, if you will, or lower the number of minutes that is considered an exposure, but they can't extend more minutes. They couldn't say 20 minutes, for example, but they could say 10 minutes, which in fact they have.
And we had one person who contacted the board who said, well, I'm a nurse and all I have to do is put a mask on. I don't, even if as long as I'm not symptomatic. Does she have some type of exemption or because she's a nurse?
Well, there are a few people that are in the category of help me here. Essential workers, and a nurse would be considered an essential worker. And so if they're not showing symptoms, they're able to return to work much faster than someone else. But teachers were talked about being considered essential workers, but they were never designated essential workers, so we don't have that luxury with our teachers. So we could have a teacher who's been exposed but never contracts the virus, but they're still off for 14 days.
Right.
So, based on some of the phone calls that I have received, and I know that the board has received, and some emails, I think there is some, based on the letter that we sent, we were focusing on why we were closing Longfellow and Thomas Jefferson Elementary School. In this particular case, this is a staff member who is COVID positive, unknown to that staff member who's COVID positive, happens to work in multiple buildings, those two buildings. And we performed our contact tracing, and this person, unfortunately, was scheduled to give a lot of in-classroom testing, coupled with a lot of small staff meetings, reviewing testing information and testing data. And all told, that knocked out a significant number of not only students, but staff by quarantine. So that trigger, at that point, we already have Eastlake Middle, who has 2 positive students, total building in quarantine, along with our entire teaching staff, with 1 COVID positive student at Willoughby Middle, current active, and we have total across the district 4 active student cases, 1 active staff case, and currently 5 active COVID positive cases in the district right now. But it is as much our fear of spread as it is knocking out staff members and our ability to staff our buildings. If you look below what you're looking at right now, this is our COVID dashboard. We update this daily. You can see in the second row, it says 5 recovered student cases, 1 staff recovered case for a total of 6. And if you total them all up across the district, these are COVID, known COVID positive or known COVID presumed students and staff members. You have a total of 11 across the district. So that triggered our protocols to close the district. I know that creates a lot of angst for a lot of folks. I agree with the last caller, many of his points, that it is not in the best mental health. He's right. It's probably not the best instruction for most students, and I believe he's right. Some of the things he didn't mention, but he alluded to, we have about 36% of our students on free and reduced lunch. And many of our families that even aren't on free and reduced lunch, but because of the impacts of COVID, are needing our assistance more than ever before. And we're handing out hundreds and hundreds of meals a week. And that's another reason. Now, we keep that going whether we're virtual or not, but the ability to get to school and have access to those things is very important. So I want to keep the school open, but I think the very difficult question is, how do we safely keep our schools open, and what's best for our students and our parents long term? Is that set our target date, come back. If we keep yo-yoing back and forth, as we know in the state of Ohio, the numbers are rising. There, I believe 2 days ago was the highest number of cases, new cases in the state of Ohio since the onset of the virus. So we're seeing multiple counties across Ohio go red. Currently Lake County is orange, but that could change at any point. And red, by the way, as a reminder, red triggers closure of our district and closure of most districts, quite frankly, around the area. It's also important to note that we're one of the we were one of the first districts that came back, so we're a little ahead of most school districts, and we are also one of the few districts that goes 5 days a week with all students. So that was that we're doing it as safely as we can, the best protocols that we possibly can, but that was in large response to our surveys of our parents who wanted their kids back in school and rejected the hybrid model. But what we're seeing on the hybrid model is schools that are using the hybrid model are dealing with as many outbreaks as we are. And I think it's also really important to note, we have done contact tracing on every one of our students. Catherine has done a phenomenal job. We know we've traced them all, and almost all of them are coming from exposures outside of the school. They aren't exposures happening in the school, they're happening out of the school, bringing them into the school. And our challenge, of course, our fear is that that spread's going to start multiplying within the framework of our schools. You know, there are things like parties, multiple situations of older siblings who come home from college. That's what, you know, when we had initially, for those of you out there, you may not have seen, and the board did see for a certain period of time, the item that I withdrew about being concerned from Thanksgiving to Christmas. What I'm concerned about are college kids coming home. We've had multiple college kids come home and give the virus to other people, to their siblings, their parents, etc. You'll hear people, and the gentleman, the last caller, indicated that the data says that the virus doesn't negatively or not significantly medically impact children. Well, by and large, I think I agree with that, but it isn't just children I'm worried about. It's our staff members, it's our parents, it's our grandparents, and I feel like I, as the superintendent, and recommendation to the board, and I know that you feel this way, we could be complicit in the spread, or we can be proactive and do our part to try and slow the spread. And so there is the balance. Catherine, can you pull up the next document? No, the one with the red writing, please. Thank you. So what you are looking at right now are the number of exposures down the left-hand side. Those are by building, by staff, or by student. And then you'll see in the next column over is the number of students in high risk. So again, these were, take the top one, NCI Eastlake student was in contact with 9 students who would have been masked down for whatever reason, and 1 staff member with mask down ended up quarantining 9 total students and 1 staff member. School of Innovation, that particular student came in contact with masked down 3 students, 2 staff members, total quarantine, meaning they were within that proximity for 10 minutes or more, 65 students, total staff quarantine 2, so it knocks out 67 students and staff members, 1 person. South High School, that student came in contact with high risk of 10 students, 8 staff members, for a total of 114 students quarantined, total of 6 staff members for 120 quarantined. Thomas Jefferson, 1 staff member, and this is our most recent situation, 55 students were at high risk for exposure. That was in the cafeteria, mostly. 31 staff members for a total of 86 quarantined. Can't operate a school district down
I
31.
think that's the most important thing. I mean, I know we mentioned is the number of staff would it even be feasible to run the school with this many staff members in quarantine at this point?
No. We rely heavily on our substitutes, which we don't always fill. Our fill rate's never 100% under normal circumstances. And many of our substitutes are older retired teachers. And many of those teachers are not former staff members, are unwilling to come into our buildings. So, and many subs got hired all across districts that have more resources than we do, and really kind of monopolize the sub market, quite frankly. And so we have a very difficult time filling our sub positions, even though we increased our rate of pay to try to be competitive. Mr. Murphy, is there anything you want to address as it relates to subs?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. In Longfellow, the singular staff member, high risk exposure to 28 students, 20 high risk staff members, and we had a quarantine of 46. So between those, that interaction alone was a quarantine of 51 staff members. Impossible to staff those buildings regardless of a COVID count or not a COVID count. Willoughby Middle, which has one grade, 8th grade quarantined right now, that's 16 high-risk exposures of students, 15 high-risk exposures of staff, and for a total of 110 students quarantined and 141 total persons quarantined. So again, knocking out 15 staff members, making it, if that were the only building we had a sub in, we might be able to sub out 15 people, but not when you combine it with all the others. So that would essentially be building 3 knocked out because of subbing issues or staffing issues, and then throw in Eastlake Middle with 2 exposures for good measure, was 45 high-risk students were exposed, 15 staff members, total quarantine of 90 students, and 150 total personnel. Edison Elementary, fortunately that was an intern and that was not exposed to anyone else, and so that didn't require any quarantining. So while I completely understand why people are upset and the very difficult position that it puts them in, this is still not even the end of the story. So if you go to the next document shows, is COVID isolated in only certain pockets or certain towns or certain areas of the school district? These are, I'm going to call on you, Catherine. Catherine does the contact tracing for these. Could you walk us through this document, Catherine?
Sure. So in the far left-hand column on our screen, I'm not sure what it is on the other people's screen, are the names of our school buildings. In the middle column, you'll see the numbers of families with COVID in their homes. So what that means is those are actually our students. When they come into school, mom calls them off and says, Johnny isn't coming to school today because dad has COVID. So at South High School, we have 9 students where currently that's happening, 9 different households. At North High School, we currently have 4 households where that's happening. We have 4 kiddos, mom and dad are calling in sick because somebody in that house has COVID. And then if you go to the far column where it says positive COVID, those are not included in the center column. Those numbers are independent of each other. So those are cases where a COVID case has happened actually in our school building. So if you look at the top one, South High School, we have 1 person, 1 family. So if you actually added your 9 and your 10, we know at South High we have 10 current families where it's in households.
Meaning that it's at high risk for that to be brought into South High School?
Yeah, we have 10 active houses in South. We have 4 active houses at North. We have 4 active, 1 in NCI, 2, so we have active households in every single building.
And so these numbers are from people that are reporting it or from the health department?
Some we get reports from the health department, some we get reports from families themselves who will call their child off sick and say, we have COVID in our house, so my child isn't coming to school today. And some are family members that will call and say, my brother's kid has COVID, I'm calling you about them, they're not coming in. So, but it's different households where we hear in different ways.
So, I guess what I would like, what I think is important for the board and the awesome responsibility of trying to keep kids safe, it's overwhelming, quite frankly. It is simply overwhelming. On one hand, we don't want to be overly cautious to the point where we put families, risk people's jobs. We know we're diminishing the educational value for many students when we go virtual. But at the same time, we have these numbers and data in front of us that would indicate to me, and I believe is shared by Dr. Jafar, are just on the edge of potentially being much greater than what they currently are. And if we, the criticism to act the way, aggressively as we acted now is that it was premature or overreacting. I don't know what, I'd rather be in that position than be in the position of being accused of and actually being knee-jerking after multiple staff members or multiple students are infected, and some will get sick, and 1 ending up on a ventilator is too many. That's the data I have to share. I know it's a lot to digest. I know it's a lot to consider. I would think that at its very earliest, we could return on the 23rd or 24th, 26th, in that range. That would be the earliest return. It's just which I get is most expeditious for many families. But how balancing the reality of the need for safety is it's a very heavy, hard decision to make.
Steve, you talked about the possibility that, say we did come back on the 26th, that, within a period of, possibly a few weeks after that, or who knows how long after that, a similar situation might arise. Could you tell us, maybe what kind of that yo-yo effect might have on the quality of education in terms of?
Yeah, I don't know what's, well, let's take pockets of our students. Take special needs students. probably more so than any of our other population, constant change is not good. It's also more challenging to educate special needs students from a virtual learning platform than it is in person, without question. So, you know, at this point, we're reviewing some of that information. Take students that are in our Excel Tech programs like welding and cosmetology. You heard me say earlier that we are in the process of bringing safe return plans for those programs. You cannot effectively, for a long period of time, learn how to, any lengthy period of time in my view, learn how to weld by watching a computer screen. To learn to weld, you've got to weld. We need those students to be in welding, in our nursing program, doing their clinicals, and many of them are hours-based programs. So if they don't get their hours in, they can't sit for their boards, and they can't thus be certified in whatever area or expertise they're trying to become certified in. So we can social distance a little bit better in those classes. We can up our protocols to the extent that we possibly can, but I can't tell you that if we bring back welding that there won't be an exposure in welding. I can't tell you that. So we could end up quarantining there again. That's possible. Our younger students, a sophomore learning at home isn't ideal, but that's one thing. And a kindergartner learning at home is something entirely different. That puts parents in a very, very difficult position. But unfortunately, some of our greatest exposures have been in elementary buildings so far, which I would not have predicted. Secondly, I think there is a tremendous amount of pressure that some of our students place on other students not to report, and replace on parents not to report. Rather, stay home until you feel better, then come back, but don't report it, don't get tested, because that could jeopardize our athletics, for example, or our activities, or our ability to go to school. And it's gotten to the point where some of our students that have quarantined, and students have figured out what student was presumed positive or COVID positive, are bullied by other students. So that's a consideration. But overall, this transition from brick and mortar to virtual is going to be a total of about a 4 or 5 day transition period before we hope to be fully up and operational by Thursday. Our second challenge that we have is computers. It isn't that we didn't order them in a timely fashion. It isn't that we weren't unwilling to spend the money. We had, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, we had 500 computers that were supposed to be in several weeks ago, stopped at the border, and returned to China under suspicion of violation of child labor laws. We have another 1,500 or 1,000? 1,500? 1,500 more Chromebooks that are weeks behind. So we're trying to get them in, but it's a challenge as well. So there are challenges on either side, a brick and mortar approach, a virtual approach, without question. But that's why I thought it was imperative to put a reopening plan together. It's much easier to make these decisions and set your protocols and set your expectations when you're not in the throes of hundreds of people watching you on a video, or people emailing you, or in an emotional state, but rather in a more clear-headed view of how you want to handle these potential situations. That's why we put together, I think, a pretty extensive reopening plan that I know other districts have followed, and that is what we did and why it says what it is. So when we hit, we actually would have minimally had 4 buildings quarantined, as much due to staffing as any other issue. Minimally. So I've talked a lot. I'll turn it over to you.
So it looks like the numbers that you gave us, there were 9 COVID positive, either students or staff, and it ended up quarantining over 600 people.
Go back just to make sure. I believe it's 11.
11.
Yeah, it's
11, okay.
11, correct.
And at least 1, 2, 3, and the number of staff, like you said, is very high in at least 3 of the buildings, 4 of the buildings.
We simply could not open many of our buildings. Even if you said, Steve, open the buildings, open them all up, I would say to you, we cannot physically open all of our buildings. We could open some of them, but not all of them.
And so based on the, I guess,
Yeah.
following that same train of thought is, the earliest that we could physically open all of our buildings is going to be that 26th date.
Catherine, can you count those numbers for me and look at your calendar and give me?
Yeah, I sure can. So if we went with the exact quarantine date, the final day would be technically the Thursday, the 22nd, but to bring it back on a Friday.
So what would that Monday be?
Very difficult. Monday would be the 26th.
October 26th. Okay.
And if we were to put that date out there, it's really only a target because we have to see what's going on between now and then.
I would recommend if we put the target date to reopen, if we set it on October 26th, I would recommend that we have a board meeting, schedule a board meeting for, say, that Wednesday or Thursday, whatever would meet your schedules the best. Look at the data that we have, that we know. I mean, we'll still know, we will still know reported COVID cases that come up. That, because again, the exposures are coming outside the walls of our buildings. So primarily, at least up to this point, that we know of. But we've had all these exposures just within the last couple of days. You know, there was, for example, a large event in Eastlake, Trick or Trunk. Hundreds of students masked together, some with masks, some without masks. I don't know if that will be a trigger point or not. And those are things that are beyond our control that could spike numbers. We won't know where the county is. Perhaps we could be red by then. Perhaps the numbers will go down and we'll be less, and we'll be in a better shape. Maybe we'll be yellow. Maybe we won't have any exposures, in which case it would make it easy to go ahead and make the determination to open on the 26th. But I think that my advice would be that we have a board meeting. The reason I say Wednesday or Thursday is trying to give parents as much notice as possible to know if we're going to open or we're not going to be open. Do I hear that as the target date we want to shoot for? Is October 26th?
Yes, that's what I would do.
And just for housekeeping, would Wednesday or Thursday, Thursday would give us one more day of information, but one day less notification to parents. Does anyone on the board have a definite conflict with either of those days? So those dates would be the 21st or 22nd.
On the Thursday would be better myself, but
Are there any objections to having it Thursday?
Yeah.
I mean, I could go with Tuesday if that worked out any bit for everybody else.
recommend Thursday over Tuesday,
Yeah.
just because that feels a little too soon.
But Mike might have a,
Oh,
Okay. Yeah, so I do have a meeting on Thursday. If we can do it earlier, I can make it.
like,
Like if we do 6 o'clock, I can do it on Thursday.
okay, I'll figure out how to make that work for me too. So we're gonna schedule a board meeting for the 22nd. The agenda item will be to review our reopening plan for the 26th.
I'm going to continue to move forward, reviewing over the next day or so. My priority tomorrow, reviewing reviewing athletic and extracurricular safe return plans, along with our plans to safely return our hour-based programs at Excel Tech. And get those back in session as soon as we can make sure our protocols are in place, which would mean the next, today is Monday, hopefully the target date for that would be Wednesday. Athletics could be Tuesday.
Okay. Next item for our business is the notification of our next regular meeting. Let me pull that up. The next regular meeting of the Board of Education will be November 9th here at 35353 Curtis Boulevard, with whether or not that is a virtual or in-person meeting to be determined by the conditions at the time. Hopefully, we'll all be able to have visitors, but we'll find out that way. And then I would like to hear a motion for the adoption of the consent calendar.
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr.
I make a motion to adopt the consent calendar.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President,
Mr.
I will
Roskis.
second that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Roskis. Do I hear any discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Charnello?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zerrin?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
Carries 5-0.
And last item for the agenda is adjournment. Do I hear
I meant to inform you of something else if I
Sure.
could. With a target date of reopening on the 26th, I envision that some people will be obviously excited about the notion of getting their kids back in brick and mortar. And some of our brick and mortar kids, I think those parents, in light of the numbers, might say, I don't want my student to go back to brick and mortar. I want them to remain virtual. For grades 6 through 12, we can accommodate that currently. In grades K through 5, we have not been able to accommodate that by virtue of the way we have those teachers being fully dedicated online teachers. I would like to let you know that it would be my intent to open up an option for our brick and mortar parents who now want to change their mind and go virtual even in K-5, the ability to do that. Mr. Murphy is magic, and him and Mrs. Kevrin are gonna make that happen, but what I would do is put out some survey information or some enrollment information out to the community by the end of the week, and early next week have an opportunity for parents to sign up. I know that parents isn't the maximum amount of time, I understand that, but what you have to understand is if it ends up creating a new position, we have to post that position. And posting that position will make Mr. Murphy's curly hair on top of his head get pulled out and fall out. So it is not an easy process, but it's a process that I think we have to afford parents who have heard the information we've heard and do not want to return to brick and mortar. Maybe it'll be a handful, maybe it'll be none, maybe it'll be 500, I don't know.
Well, I think that's great that you would open up that opportunity.
Found out about it here at the meeting.
No, that's something we have to vote on.
I don't think so, because I think I have the ability to.
I just wanna make sure.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I don't
Through our
think,
reopening
I think
plans.
I have the administrative,
Right.
under the administrative guidelines, the ability to do that, but I want you to know that that's my thought process unless there's an objection.
Right. No, my thought was just whether or not we needed to make sure we,
Yeah, no, we don't need to do that.
Okay.
Okay, well, in that case, do I hear a motion to adjourn? Yes, Mr. Maher.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Mr. Maher. Do I hear a second?
Mr. President,
Mr. Jones?
I second that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Any discussion? Mr. Charnelli?
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Marrar?
Yes.
Mr. Roskis?
Yes.
Mrs. Zern?
Yes.
Dr. Beal?
Yes.
You're adjourned at 8:42.
So we'll see everyone on Thursday, the 20th.
Second.